How many of you are skeptical about the title of this talk? Okay, I see one hand. The rest of you just trust everything you see on the internet? Okay, I got two hands. All right, so we got some skepticism. So for those of you like me, so this talk's sort of made for me like maybe 8 years ago, like just how to do this semi the right way. Here's the hardware. If this is all you care about, right? If you just want to know how do you actually get it to under $500, and note that's $500 post-tax. There's your hardware list. That's everything. I've got HomeLab on a stick up here on the thing. It's also, if you look, there's a shoestring on it. So it's not a shoestring budget, but it's on a shoestring. I had fun with that one. If you want some upgrades, right? You're like, I've got a little bit more than $500. Let's make it a $1,000, starter HomeLab. Here are my recommended upgrades to sort of keep this ethos, but to make it a little more oomph, a little more fun, maybe. So I do want to point out some of the things that this talk is not. Right, the talk title is not an epic home lab, or your perfect home lab, or the best, or the do everything, or home prod. No, home lab versus home prod here. The talk title is Starting Home Lab for Under $500, and I'm really excited it's not this. You see what's different? Yeah, that asterisk. I didn't need an asterisk for this one. So anyhow, what do I mean when I say home lab versus home prod? So this is one of those challenge ideas, not people. I know that there are a lot of you here that will argue with me on that one, and that's totally fine. You can be wrong. We've still got some freedom of speech here. You can be wrong if you want, and I'd be happy to have discussions either in the talk section or afterward and banter about this one. Note that this font is actually bigger than the title. I think that's a more important takeaway than the title, is that home lab and home prod are not the same thing. So I've got some assumptions, right? All talks have some assumptions. I tried to minimize them a bit. Some have more assumptions than others. My assumptions here are that you have some sort of Ethernet computer access, whether that's a laptop or a desktop or some other thing that you have. You have a computer that can use Ethernet already. I also assume that you have some sort of home network already. That can totally just be the thing that came from my ISP that cost $40 on eBay. That totally counts. But I assume you're not like, well, I don't have an ISP. How am I supposed to? Like, no, you need something at home for this. I also assume that you have the ability to search. I'm not going to list any specific search engines in this slide, but you can use a search engine or a GPT of your choice, and you can find procedures and information that you don't know when you get stuck on things, because this isn't all-encompassing. If this were going to be all-encompassing, we'd be here till like 2 a.m., even just to go over that stuff. So it's more of an overview and some of the things that bit me, so hopefully they don't bite you. Or maybe at least it doesn't hurt as much when they do bite you. Passwords and scope. So feel free to log on to that. The SSID is SecDSM. OSs are fair game. If you want to backdoor Proxmox, go for it. If you want to backdoor OpenSense, go for it. If you could, please those stay out of the firmware. So like don't break my BIOS. Don't break my switch firmware. And the switch firmware is very breakable, I'm sure. I don't know if Nick Stark is here, but he helped me with a couple little things there. So anyhow, yeah, here are the passwords. Basically, everything is SecDSM, except the PSK wouldn't let me make it that short. So the PSK is SecDSM123. And then there's the Unify URL. You do need the port 8443 and the HTTPS. If you do HTTP, it's like, we got a weird error. This isn't HTTP. Yeah, it's HTTPS. What needs does this fulfill, right? And feel free if anyone not get the passwords that needs them. No? Okay, cool. What needs are fulfilled, right? Each home lab is going to be a little bit different because you're each going to have different needs for it. So the needs fulfilled here, and I view these as sort of the core of any home lab, not just mine and what I need. So that's why I picked these for this talk. Wired networking with VLANs, as well as wireless networking, just because nobody likes to be chained to Ethernet. And if you do, I'm sorry. Some sort of compute. Not a lot of compute. As you can see, it's a mini PC that was like $230 on Amazon. It's not going to win any awards there. But you need some compute and some way to easily spin up things and then be like, that didn't work. Let me try again. Delete, recreate, however you do that. A firewall. because I'm not sure if you're aware, this is an information security meetup, and firewalls are hashtag security. So we have a firewall, and then optional or nice to have. I am not getting into this much, if at all, in this talk, but perhaps a future talk. There are things like Tailscale or Cloudflare. Someone did a talk a few months back about Cloudflare tunnels, I believe they're called. Tailscale has a similar thing. It's sort of roll your own ZTNA for free if you're a consumer user, a not commercial user. And then VPNs just in general, right? Both of those are VPN-esque, but you can also just do your own VPN. So what am I going to cover? What am I not going to cover, right? Considering all those needs, considering sort of why I'm doing this. Everything on the left is covered, everything on the right isn't. So basically core setup items, without getting into the nitty-gritty, without teaching you about what VLANs are at an RFC level, without any of that stuff. Also, you'll note IPv6 is not something I'm going to cover. I'm sticking to IPv4 on this one. So let me make sure I've got what I need here. Yeah, I might cover more stuff in a future talk if anyone's interested, especially with the APs. And by the way, while I would like questions for the end, if I don't say something clearly enough or say something factually wrong, feel free to interrupt. This may be the quiet listen room, but also if I'm not making any sense, it's probably not just you. So that said, what should HomeLab be philosophically, right? It should be as separate as possible from other infrastructure, right? It's an environment to break things. It can be okay to disappear. It can be okay to break. If you need to completely rebuild it from the firmware up, like I am probably going to do after this talk, after letting all of you onto it, that's a fine thing. The HomeLab should be a safe environment for that. One note on this is that if you're spending more time trying to get the HomeLab working or maintaining it than you are actually learning with it, perhaps you're doing it wrong. This was a hard lesson for me to learn, and part of the motivation, as I mentioned, for making this talk. It's all the stuff that I should have known. Don't go into debt for a HomeLab. They're fun, but they're not that fun. And don't get into arguments with, significant others or roommates or anything like that. Your HomeLab should not be something they depend on, right? That's home prod, the production environment at your home prod. That's what that should be. Your HomeLab should be separate enough that it's not going to cause any issues there as much as possible. There also is a term, and I feel I need to call out this term because I don't like this term. I haven't found a new term that I like better, though. Some of you may have heard the term WAF or WAF for wife acceptance factor. Now, like I say, I don't like that. It's too gendered. It doesn't meet, currently how we're trying to, make sure the industry is equal and all that. It's a bad thing to just assume that that's how the household runs. Also, as someone that has broken internet for just roommates, I would go so far as to say household member acceptance factor, but that's, another thing. Everyone but the dog is probably going to complain if you break their internet. So that said, how do we do that? How do we get those connections to the internet, right? You don't want your HomeLab to be internet free. That's no fun. So one way of doing that, the easiest one, also generally the more expensive one, is to just have two ISPs, right? Sometimes that's not an option. A lot of times it's an option, but you're stuck between just those two, and then how do you pick, right? And do you really want the added cost of that? So you just have one environment for ISP, and there you go. You're done. Separate environments, you're good to go. Another way, and this is generally sort of my recommended way of doing this in most cases, again, depending on the needs of your HomeLab, which we'll get into a little bit more here. And that's what this one's using. So this one, instead of an Ethernet uplink, is using a little travel router that's connected to the Foundry's Wi-Fi. So you should have internet on there, but it's janky. It's slow. It is self-limiting because it only supports 2.4 gigahertz. And I believe only like first generation N networking, so it's not even the good 2.4. The thing with this style of architecture on this slide is that it's good for uptime, right? You're not going to have those arguments with the others in your house when something goes down unless you really messed up, because your HomeLab doesn't affect that. However, if you're playing with malware, this might not be the one you want. Because if that malware is reaching out to things, by default, with firewalls being how they work, right, they let stuff out but not in, you'll be able to go from the HomeLab and just start probing things on your home prod network, which if you've got any maybe XP or Windows 10 here in another 10 months on your network, that might not be the greatest thing if you're playing with fire in your HomeLab live malware. So how do we fix that? Well, the other way, right? If you're going to be playing with malware, I'm going to recommend this topology. Note that it's just flip-flopped, right? HomeLab is now the one that we depend on that gets the internet, and we just sort of have home prod double natted behind that. This is great for malware because basically the malware can talk to the internet and do its sketchy stuff online, but it's not going to talk backward through the firewall to infect your home prod. Now, this is bad for uptime, though, because if you break something or need to rip out your HomeLab, now your whole prod internet is down in your household. How do we fix, what's the best of both worlds, right? Well, it's also the expensive one. It's like this. So you have two ISPs, but you give both your home prod and your HomeLab both internets. Now, the advantages of this are it fixes the malware issue, right? Because they're separate. They don't talk to each other directly. It's good for uptime because one, it's separate, so you're not, if you break it, it doesn't matter. And you've got two ISPs to choose from. So how likely is it that both ISPs are down at the same time? Well, it's likely enough that it happens, but a lot less likely than either one being down individually. It's also really bad for simplicity. As you might imagine with this, it's a bit more complex to get set up. Again, I've got I believe it's stupid ISP tricks talk planned that I will go into more detail about how you can do this with your home internets. It's sometimes known as a dual home or multi-WAN setup, and you would just do the same thing on both those. So for this talk, this is more or less the layout I'm using. I don't have a logical diagram here about all that, but it's pretty typical for SOHO, small office, home office, or small medium business, except in this case, the firewall is a VM. So in case the text might be a little small, the uplink, the little cloud, that's basically the travel router or Foundry's Wi-Fi. And then I've got a web-managed PoE switch, which is a TP-Link, which they're sketchy. More on that later. I've got a mini PC, and then a wireless access point, or WAP. Not to be confused with a WAP, which is a pop song that we're not getting into here. So the mini PC setup, what do you need to do with that? CSM, also known as compatibility support mode, is what used to be called legacy. Yeah, probably disable that. Either that or force it to use that. That seems to be one of the biggest cause of issues I've run into. But also disable secure boot, because that also causes issues, and we're handling the security in other ways. So unless you're really paranoid and need that feature, great. Also, any other settings in the BIOS that you need? The two that I can think of that might bite you are virtualization technology. If for whatever reason, the mini PC you've got, usually they come turned on in my experience, but if they have that off, you're going to have a real hard time running virtual machines when you've got the virtualization stuff turned off in the BIOS for the CPU. The other thing is BIOS auto power on after power fail. In most consumer computers, this is really easy to find. You go to like power settings and then be like auto, recovery mode. You want on, off, last state, or some just give you on or off. In these mini PCs, it is stupid. They use like a vendor-specific acronym, and the layout and the acronym are different with like every model they produce. So you'll probably just have to Google like the specific model of mini PC, the specific BIOS version, and then auto power on. And you'll find someone on a forum that has complained about it, and someone else that posted an answer. Or at least that's been my experience the whole time. Pro tip, if you have a label maker, print out the labels for the keys that you need to get into the BIOS and get into the boot menu so you don't have to go look it up, because they're not standard. It's not like Dell where it's always F12 and delete. It's usually like F7 and maybe F2 or maybe escape or maybe delete, because they're going to be nice-ish. Or maybe delete does something different in this one. So once you've got the hardware right, and of course if you've already done VMs and whatnot and VLANs and all that, you're like, oh, well, I've got ESXi at home. Great, use that. You don't need to worry about the hardware setup or Proxmox. I'm going for a $500, not a Broadcom pricing structure, so we're going to use Proxmox for this one. Proxmox, for those not aware, is a Debian-based freemium open source hypervisor. I believe is the shortest description you can have for it. The hypervisor, just think of that, that's where the VMs live, or the virtual machines. PVE is often used a lot in their documentation. PVE stands for Proxmox Virtual Environment, and I believe it's actually the default host name when you're setting up a Proxmox. It has all sorts of features and stuff and whatnot that are totally not talked about, mentioned, or acknowledged in any way in this talk. That could be probably a whole series of talks, and there are some people on YouTube that have covered it pretty thoroughly. So you will need installation media. I did not include that in the cost of the HomeLab. I'm assuming you also have a flash drive that you can wipe to put the installer on. Ventoy, if any of you use Ventoy, which is a great tool. If you don't check out Ventoy, it's amazing. Basically, Ventoy is just drop the ISO files directly onto a file system on the flash drive, and then you can boot from them, because Grub scans them and lets you like chain load them. Yeah, that doesn't work with Proxmox, though. You'll need to actually do a DD or a CAT redirect or something like that to make your flash drive. Use one of the tools that does it for you. Licensing and updates. I'm not going to get into the, shall we call them, partially legal hacks to get free updates from Proxmox, but there are ways to do things like that. By default, you don't get many updates when you try and update. It's like, you don't have subscription, I don't like you, go away. And you just have to go, oh, okay, I'm sorry. Sorry for asking. But if you want to get updates, there are ways to do that. So how do we set it up? Slide 1 of 5. You can tell this is a little bit of work. So CPU ID pass-through. You want the type to be host if you're going to have a VM in there. I've run into issues when it's not host. If it's host, everything just kind of works in my experience. Because it does a thing where instead of saying, oh, I'm a QEMU, CPU model, whatever, it's like, no, whatever CPU's in that box, that's what it claims it is. And the Linuxy crap on top of it just pretty much works with that. Any second level virtualization is especially prone to this, right? So on one of these, I'm going to have an Ubuntu server in a VM on Proxmox. And then in that Ubuntu server VM, I'm going to be running Docker, which is another layer of virtualization that needs those features enabled. So it just makes things easier. Make sure for your Proxmox, this is a big, big note that has bit me before. Pick out your IP address of your Proxmox instance before installing it. Okay? Now keep in mind, you're going to need to install your firewall after this. So you kind of need to plan out your network a little bit ahead, right? What's your subnet going to be? What's your IP layout? All that stuff. Pick your Proxmox IP address. The reason why is you basically just have to go and manually edit config files if you want to change it later. I'm sure there is a way to do it through the GUI. I haven't found it to be reliable, though. Now, what VLANs do you want for things? We're going to use VLAN 1 for demo. Any network people here are probably cringing at me saying we're going to use VLAN 1 because you really shouldn't use VLAN 1 for a lot of things in any professional environment. This is not a professional environment. This isn't Home Pro. This isn't even Home Prod. This is HomeLab. We're going to mess things up. So this is sort of the screenshot. When you're creating virtual machine, that's what it looks like. I like to set up all the VMs first, the hardware, if you will, the virtual hardware of them, then go back through and install the OS and do all the other crap. After you install the OS, make sure you remove the ISO file media thing. Otherwise, it'll just try and boot from the ISO again, and you'll just be in an infinite, loop of reinstalling it every time you go to boot your VM, which is kind of funny until you get to like the third iteration, and you're like, what am I doing wrong? You want to make sure that the interface, the network interface on each of the VLANs is, or each of the network interface on each of the VMs is VLAN aware. That way it can actually use the VMs or the VLANs that you're handing to it from the switch, especially with one of these mini PCs. You'll notice it only has one NIC on it. And technically it has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, but for the purposes of this, it's got one Ethernet port, and that's all we're going to use. So if you want to use multiple VLANs and have maybe a guest network and have your HomeLab not guest network and maybe do some sketchy stuff over here on an isolated malware network and all this stuff. You want to have 6, 7, 8, 9 VLANs. That port needs to be able to handle them all because eventually the packets all physically go through that connector to the switch to the rest of the network that you're going to build. Router on a stick. If you want to know more about this layout when it comes to firewalls, look up router on a stick. And basically, you just check VLAN aware here, and then you don't have to do much else in Proxmox. Set the VMs to start when Proxmox boots, if that's something you want. I'm one of those people that's like, if I have the thing plugged in, I'm okay with it sucking power. So auto power up, and then auto start all my VMs, and then auto start all my Dockers, and auto start all the things. If you have power usage concerns, perhaps don't do this. But that's how I like it to work, so that's what I do. Now, you want to create a Linux VLAN in Proxmox. For each VLAN, you want to, quote unquote, work via the bridge. The bridge is basically the interface that houses all the VLANs and stuff that we're going to be using for this. If you watch the YouTube video and the slide notes of this slide, and the slides will be available afterwards, there's a slide note, there's a YouTube link. It goes more in-depth tutorial. It's like a 5-minute chunk of like a 30-minute video, if I remember right. This is only needed if you're doing things other than bridge or VLAN 1. If you try and do this and create a Linux VLAN 1 and then set stuff to that, you're just going to break it. I know because I did it when I was writing this presentation. Yeah, go ahead. How do you get the operating system onto Proxmox? You will need to install it from an ISO. So you'll go to the internet, you'll download an ISO, and if you're really sketchy, you can torrent the ISO. And then you'll check the checksum if you care about the integrity, and then you'll upload it to Proxmox, and then you'll set it as like the media, the hardware thing in Proxmox, and then you'll go through the wizard using the web UI as your console and do the install things. And I think I have a little bit more detail of the specific OSs as we go through some of these and setting up the specifics there. Good question. So, OpenSense basics, right? So we've talked about the hypervisor, the hardware, and the virtual hardware, both the physical hardware and the virtual hardware. What about OpenSense? This is your firewall. pfSense is another very, very popular one. Feel free to use your own thing too, right? If you've got a Sophos VTM lying around, or whatever those things are. Is it VTM? I don't remember what they call a device. If you've got a checkpoint firewall, if you've got something else you want to use, great, chuck it at that. I know Reed, I don't know if Reed's here, he likes to, I believe, throw pfSense on old checkpoint firewalls because they typically work pretty well. So yeah, do what you want for firewall. Again, $500, this is what we're doing. So I used MonoWall back in the day, if anyone remembers that. MonoWall was forked, became pfSense. pfSense was forked, became OpenSense. And then MonoWall said, we're shutting our project down, but go use OpenSense. So fun little history facts there for you. In this case, in the case of what I'm doing with the way I've architected all this, it is providing the DHCP, or Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, so you can just plug in and get an IP address without doing extra work. It'll provide the VPN, if there's a VPN set up later, and all the other fun stuff, a DNS cacher, and yada yada. Yeah. Distro is distribution, by the way. That was in my slide notes that I forgot to mention. Now, considerations for this, right? Do you have a public IPv4? If not, you might have issues with things like VPNs and whatnot. Do you need any port forwards from the WAN side to the LAN side? Because if you're going through your home prod, you're going to need to set up that port forward 2 places, right? You're going to do it, get it from home prod to the HomeLab firewall, and then again from the HomeLab firewall into whatever you're doing on your HomeLab. If it's just the sort of reverse, right? If you're dealing with malware and you have HomeLab directly connected to the internet, you'll just need to do it on that firewall. The VLAN layout for this talk, or for any of you that might be playing with the gear, is that VLAN 1 is our LAN side, our local area network, the safe side, and then WAN is wide area network, or the upstream, the uplink side of things. So, setup. 6 slides for this one. Router on a stick, everything's VLANs, sort of alluded to that. Even for HomeProd, though, I'm a huge fan of router on a stick. And the big reason why is because for a long time, I was just using like ancient Core 2 Duo boxes and those sometimes would fail. And most of them only had a single nick on the motherboard, and sometimes that was the part that failed. And I'd get a new one out of the basement, dust it off, install OpenSense on it. But the problem was if I had a NIC card, I'd have to remember to move the NIC card between things. I was like, if I could just get this so I had one cable for network every time I had to replace this, that'd be great. And then it's even easier if you back up your configs, as you should. Anyone that's not backing up your configs, shame on you. Go home and back up your configs tonight. Anyhow, rant over. So if you have backed up your configs, all you need to do is just run a sed command. Or if you are a Windows user, go to Notepad or whatever, find and replace Mac. I don't know, probably something like that works. And then just replace the interface name. That's all you need to do for whatever your new hardware is, and then it just works. Just upload the config, and it's like, oh yeah, I know all my VLANs. We're good to go. And again, layout for this talk, 1 LAN, 2 WAN. Make sure to uncheck the firewall box in Proxmox. That's asking you if you want Proxmox to firewall it, which you've got firewalls on your firewalls that might make for a really good meme. It's going to make for a really bad time. Set up a DNS alias is another pro tip. So what I mean by this, I ran into this thing with OpenSense that was driving me up a wall. What would happen is I would go to my firewall's host name, and sometimes it would work, and sometimes it wouldn't. And what I discovered was there's this thing called hairpinning, and I've dealt with hairpinning a little bit before, but basically what happens is because it has multiple IP addresses, right? The firewall host name applies to its interface on every VLAN, as well as its public IP address. And if I was on a VLAN that could only get to the firewall interface page, but other VLANs couldn't, but it resolved to one of those other VLANs' IP addresses, it wouldn't work. And if it was resolving to its public IP address, it wouldn't work. So if you make an alias that's just this host name, which is different from your actual host name, right? So if your firewall's name is myfirewall123, make your DNS alias firewall host name that works 345 or something like that, right? Make it something different. And then you just go into services, unbound DNS overrides, host overrides, which is all listed out there. And then you have to go into the other spot that I put on the slide and go there, and then it just works. Once you hit apply, double check in OpenSense. There's usually an apply or a save, sometimes both, sometimes a save, and then it's like, oh, you saved, but you haven't applied yet, which can be annoying, but it can also save your butt, so you should appreciate it. Now, VLAN 1, in a lot of cases, just uses the, and I put quote-unquote physical, right? How do we talk about virtual hardware without specifying, a VLAN, a virtual LAN versus the virtual hardware of, anyhow. So that's effectively the physical interface, the untagged. And then for VLAN 2, you just make a VLAN that's 2, and then you assign it to that physical interface and say anything that's on VLAN 2 is going to come from here. And if you're a router on a stick, that's really easy because every VLAN you add, you just attach it to that same one interface and you're good to go. Let's see, that's under interface, other types of VLAN as I put here. So after the VLAN set, you need to assign your WAN, right? So VLAN setup comes before you really tell OpenSense much about how you're setting up your networks. So then you pick whatever VLAN you had. In this case, it was 2, and you assign that to WAN or the uplink stuff. And you might need to use the console if you can't find it in the web UI. I ran into an issue where I didn't quite do it right the first time, and using the web UI, I just made a mess of things, but then I went into the console, and it worked just fine. Now, for those that aren't aware, the console would be if you had the physical machine in front of you with a monitor and all that plugged in, that's your console. Now, since it's a virtual environment, you're going to Proxmox and doing the web UI version of the console for that, but it's the same deal, versus the web UI for OpenSense itself, which is, the pretty GUI that you can configure things in a more fun way. Now, the setup I have here is I have a note to self here at the bottom. If you're going to troubleshoot this, make sure you go OSI layer 1, or the physical layer, and work your way up to 7. Physical data link network transport system presentation application, right? For those, I have to say it fast, otherwise I don't remember it, but I know that those are the layers. And then 7 through 1, no, I can't do it backwards unless I go look it up. 7 through 1 will give you headache, and it'll take a long time to troubleshoot. The reason I say this is because I spent probably 25 minutes before I realized my Ethernet cable was plugged into the wrong port on the switch. And that was my problem. It was the wrong VLAN because it was the wrong port, and I hated myself for it. But it's all good. If you want to allow bogon or private networks, go ahead and do that. It is needed if you're doing sketchy stuff, but this is HomeLab. Of course you're doing sketchy stuff. And if you're putting it behind HomeProd, that's considered sketchy in this case. So go ahead and check that box. You'll be fine. And if not, it's your HomeLab. Who cares? Don't forget to save and apply changes and all that fun stuff. All right. We got the physical hardware stuff, including our hypervisor. We got OpenSyn set up. We got a firewall now. Guess what? That means we have a network. We have a network. We can go to the internet. It's some fun stuff. What are we going to do with that internet? We're going to go to the Linux server websites, right? We're going to go to those torrents, and we're going to get those ISOs. We're going to be that hacker type of person. Now, considerations for this. I'm sure everyone in here has an opinion on whether or not you should use Arch Linux. I use Ubuntu. So we're going to be using Ubuntu for this demo, specifically 24.04.1 in case there's some minor detail that matters based on a different Ubuntu version. Use a distro that works for you. Don't just listen to what I'm doing. Tailor this to your needs, your wants, your desires, all that good stuff. This is a great spot, in my experience, for things like DDNS clients or dynamic DNS. If you're not familiar with that, we'll talk more afterwards. This is also where something like Tailscale, Cloudflare tunnels, any other just, I need a box on the network to do crap for me. Those are great spots to put it, as on your first Linux server. Any other scripting and automation and whatnot, just so you're not putting it on the hypervisor directly, which you probably could do, but you probably shouldn't do. Now, Ubuntu Server plus Docker. A huge shout out to Nate Subra on this one. Whenever I cannot figure it out and I spend too long cussing about it, I send him a DM, and it's like Nate GPT. He just tells me things and I try it, and it usually works on the second try. It doesn't work on the first try because I made a typo. So yeah, if you want to know more about this or securing the SSH, because I do have SSH on it, I've got these QR codes here are links to a previous talk I gave about securing SSH. One's the video, one's the slides. I don't remember which is which. When you install Docker on Ubuntu, the way that I recommend is use the docker.io package. If you use the Docker package, it installs a snap. And I don't know if you've ever dealt with Ubuntu and snaps, but it'll have you saying other four-letter words, not snap. So I use the docker.io, which is basically a very delayed upstream proper Docker that installs not in the snappy way. However, I've heard that if you actually go out and properly download the sources or whatever, that's an even better way to do it. But that's not what I did here. So let me make sure my slide notes. Yeah, and I also gave talks at the Linux user group. Any of you interested in Linux at all? Central Iowa Linux user group. I'm a huge fan of them. I gave some talks on Linux-specific securing SSH there as well. So how do we set this up in Proxmox, right? We know what we need the server for. We know what we kind of want it to do. We want to run some Docker crap on it. So how do we do that? We need to set it up in Proxmox. Make sure your VLANs are set, right? Is the hardware port in Proxmox is the trunk port, so you need to pick your VLANs here, unless you're going to configure it in the OS. I only like configuring it in the OS for my firewall. I like to have Proxmox configure it as a physical thing for everything else. So this is what that looks like. I like to set mine up with reserved DHCP. That is a point of contention. If you've dealt with that before, some people really like that. Some people really hate it. Yeah, lots of opinions to go around. Whatever works for you. Now, Docker and Unify. So many things to say about this. So is anyone here totally not familiar with Unify stuff or Ubiquity stuff? Okay, I got one hand. Unify is a product line from a company called Ubiquity that makes all sorts of networking stuff. And for a lot of people that don't want to do this much legwork, that just want network that mostly works and give them mostly features, they buy Ubiquity gear. Unify specifically is more or less their wireless stuff line. At least that's what I use it for. The caveat is you need a controller. Now, you can do that for free, or you can buy one of the little cloud key things. If you run a controller, you basically have Mac, Windows, or Linux. Take your pick. If you pick Linux, it works fine on some distros. On Debian-based distros like Ubuntu, it is a fight, a big fight. So Docker, that's why we use Docker, right? Because then it really doesn't matter. Now, I could just go to Docker and find that one guy that figured everything out and use his Docker container and it would be fine. But that's too easy. That doesn't teach me anything. This is HomeLab. We're going to learn. So because Ubiquity is dead set on making it as difficult as possible, even Linux servers.io, which makes a bunch of Docker stuff, this screenshot from like the pure white text on down is a screenshot from their page. They basically said, we're done. We're not trying to make this work in one Docker image anymore. We'll provide the application, you provide the database, call it good. So that means you need 2 Docker containers now, right? You need one for the Unified Network application, and you need one for MongoDB. And for those not familiar, controller, all that does is basically the access point, since it's a quote-unquote pro-grade access point. You don't log into it and configure stuff like you would with an all-in-one router access point thing. It phones home to a controller, and the controller tells it what to do. Tells it all about the VLANs and SSIDs and all that fun stuff. So this screenshot is probably a little small, and even if we zoom in all the way, but if you screenshot it at 1080p later, you should be able to see the whole thing. This is what I came up with after some back and forth with Nate, as I mentioned, that basically does the whole thing. If you know Docker, don't use this, because it sucks, okay? But guess what? It sucks, but it works. So I was happy enough with it. This is how I did it. And yeah, it basically sets up both the Linux server.io network application thing and the official MongoDB database thing. Now, great. So we've installed Docker on our Linux server. I'm not going to go back over all the other crap we did, right? But we installed Docker on it, and now we've got these 2 Docker containers up. But they're not doing anything. We need to like go into Unify and tell it to do the Unify things, right? So when you log in, it'll ask you for creds for the first time. Okay, great, that's fine. You can bypass the cloud stuff. It really, 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 really wants you to connect it to the cloud. But it's not quite as ornery as Windows 11. It's more like Windows 10 2404 or whatever, right? Like it's pushy, but there's that little thing down at the bottom that if you scroll and click the text you can barely see, you can bypass the cloud setup. The inform URL is a critical setting. I'm going to say that again. The inform URL is a critical setting. Factory resets will be in your future if you get that wrong. I know because I do it about every 3rd time that I do this. What that is it's basically the phone home IP address for the access point. The reason it's a critical setting in this setup is because as soon as you get it set up enough and tell it, okay, have fun, it'll start adopting, is what they call it. It'll start adopting or basically taking control of any access points that it sees that are in a factory clean state. So if you've just bought your access point and you got it on your network, it's going to go ahead and adopt it. But when it does that, it does a lookup internally to say, what's my IP address? And it goes, oh, okay, I'm 127.0.0.1. It's not actually that, right? But it's an internal IP that is internal specifically to Docker. Well, that doesn't help you if you're on the main network, right? If you're on the network at 192.168.42, because it's 42, that's the subnet for this in case you didn't catch it earlier, right? It doesn't help you that it gave itself a 10 dot or a 172 dot internal Docker address, and it set that. And there are ways, but there are not fun ways to fix that once you've done it. So just factory reset your access point at that point. Make sure your inform URL's set, then do the factory reset, and then plug it back in and let it go. Some quality of life stuff. How many of you love light mode over dark mode? Okay, I got one person in the back, and they're the one wearing the colorful shirt. So yeah, if you dress more like me, you probably want dark mode. So there is a dark mode setting, and there's also 24-hour time. I hate AM and PM. Give me 4 digits for all my times. Or if we're going into seconds, give me 6 digits, right? I don't need to one what? AM, PM, yesterday. Why isn't there 0 in front of the 1? Give me 24-hour time. So quality of life there. Okay, adopting the access point, right? Remember that inform URL? This is where it comes into play. So you adopt the access point, no charge, don't worry about it. You're not signing up for, $250,000 to have it for the rest of your life. You can send it to Midwest Electronics Recovery or something local, electronics recycler if you're done with it. Factory reset using a paperclip, or as I call it, the Universal Technology Reset Tool. I actually carry an unbit paperclip pretty much everywhere I go, specifically for that reason. You want to go to the devices icon. I don't like some of their terminology, right? Because they're clients and devices. Clients are the things that go on the network. Devices are the things that run the network with how they have it set up. So you go to the devices icon, you'll see one that's like, hey, this is ready for adoption. You go, yep, adopt. And it goes, okay, give us like 7 to 25 minutes and we'll be good to go. And then it just sort of does its thing. And then when it's done, you'll get a nice, pretty little screenshot like this that's like, it's up to date, ready to go. So then you go to the settings gear and then Wi-Fi and you make a new network, right? Because what's the point of adopting stuff and quality of life and making sure you get your informed URL if you're not going to make a network with it. So now you go here and you type in secDSM for your SSID or service set identifier. Or if you want to get real pedantic, it's ESSID, because the BSSID is basically the MAC address. I believe it's extended versus base, or the E versus B. And then, yeah, you've got your new network, and it'll be broadcasting by default, but you can configure all that stuff. You can put guest networks. You can do different VLANs. You can do all that fun stuff here. All right, the network switch. We're almost to the end. We're at slide 44 out of 50, so we're getting close. I know it was a long one. Ethernet, or IEEE 802.3, and Wi-Fi, or IEEE 802.11. And I don't remember what the IEEE acronym stands for, so I'm not going to guess. A switch switches packets. How many of you have heard of a hub before? Yeah, a lot of people. Okay, if you think you use a hub, you're probably wrong, unless you're a network person, and you're like, yeah, I do those. Yeah, or I see Arden. Yeah, Arden probably uses hubs. So anyhow. Or if it's USB, yeah, USB is a whole different thing. But if you think you use a network hub, you're probably wrong. You're probably using a switch, which is good. The way that a hub works is it gets a packet in, and then it goes, hey, everyone, I got a packet! And it's like, okay, yeah, didn't need to hear that. Whereas a switch goes, okay, who's this for? Oh, it's for you, right? And it sort of hands it off where it needs to go. There exist layer 2 and layer 3 switches, which is basically whether or not it's IP aware, whether it can do that switching with IP addresses and cross VLANs and all that fun stuff, or whether it's just strictly using an ARP table and chucking stuff around on the same VLAN. It's the doohickey that's totally not a hub, as I said here, and they come in managed and unmanaged varieties. Say it again? The question is layer 3 switch versus router. Someone else is better at answering that one than me. More or less. Yeah, they're basically the same thing at a semantics level. Router typically implies you're going to be doing a little bit of like firewalling and whatnot in the most contexts that I've heard. Doesn't have to be, but typically, like if you're talking about a home router, you're talking about an all-in-one device that does a bunch of stuff. Those are not true routers. They do routing functions, but they're not a router. If you're talking like a Cisco backbone router versus a backbone layer 3 switch, yeah, you have to ask a network engineer to get into the details on that. Okay, so the comment I'm getting is that Cisco's delineation is basically bandwidth limitations and sort of feature set and whatnot. Basically marketing and pricing is what I'm hearing. That's the difference between a router and a layer 3 switch. So managed and unmanaged. An unmanaged switch is one of those things you get at Best Buy and has 8 ports, and you just plug everything in and it just gives everything access everywhere. Managed is what you're looking for if you want to be able to tell it different VLANs. Now, you can use both of these together, right? So you can give it an unmanaged switch where you got to plug in like 5 things that go on the same VLAN, but then use a managed switch to give the unmanaged one that singular VLAN. All right, switch considerations. How many VLANs do you need? If you've only got an 8-port switch, do you really want more than 8 VLANs? You can. It's a little interesting, especially on this piece of something. Are you familiar with a specific brand, right? If you've got a bunch of Cisco certs, go get a Cisco switch. You've probably got the money for it if you've got Cisco certs, right? Go get a cheap one. Go get one that's like $300. Get an SG300 or something that runs just enough iOS to make you angry, and you'll be good to go. If you're like me and you're just a cheapskate and you can get by with TP links, great, go for that. While you still can. Amazon's been having some great sales on some TP link gear because of reasons. Also, the budget. I posted this question in the Discord, like, how much can you spend on a switch? And it's somewhere between 6 and 7 digits. But if you're considering that for your HomeLab, I think you misunderstand the point of this talk. And then, as I mentioned, like layer 2, layer 3, right? Do you just need VLANs, or do you need it to be able to do some routing stuff too? So for the TP-Link switch setup, pretty simplistic, pretty simple switch. These are sketchy. I actually found an exploitable bug on one of these, and it was fun because basically what it was is you authenticate to the switch, and now if you give someone else your IP address, they're authenticated to the switch. Or if you're behind a NAT, everyone behind the NAT is authenticated to the switch. It was not even looking at MAC address. It was just looking at IP address. And if you swapped out the MAC and updated the ARP table, it just followed the IP address. So yeah, fun little bug. They've fixed that in more recent firmware updates. And specifically, I don't know if the PoE versions were ever affected. The one I've got over here is a PoE switch, which is power over Ethernet, so it can power the access point without an injector. But I found that on a not PoE model. Anyhow, 802.1Q is the sort of spec number, standard number, for the type of VLAN you want. What does that mean? I don't know. Go look up the RFC. I'm not getting into that. I'm not a network engineer. I can say the word VLAN, and that makes me happy enough. So the enable radio button, because it also supports like a port-based VLAN, which is basically it just pretends to physically segment the ports out. Type of VLAN, name, number, hit add modify. Yeah, it's weird. Not a great web UI, but you get what you pay for in this. And then you type the VLAN number again to edit it, and then you again hit the add modify button. It's weird, but it works mostly. PVID settings. I am not great at talking about this one, but basically what you want to do is whatever your untagged VLAN is, you want that to be your PVID number. Otherwise, stuff don't work. You want it to work. So you set the PVID to the same as the untagged. Tagged versus untagged. So VLANs use this thing called tags. And basically what that means is every port, you're going to want one untagged VLAN, and you can have 0 through over 4,000 tagged VLANs on that. And if you have more than just a single untagged port, if you have a single untagged port, that's called an access port. And if you have untagged plus all these tagged stuff, that's considered a trunk port of some sort. Now, some semantics say it's only a trunk port if it passes all the VLANs, otherwise it's a hybrid port and all that, but that's going way down the road. That doesn't matter. And just know that if you want only this port to be able to access only this thing, make it untagged, make it that port, and set the PVID to the same thing. If you want it to be able to access all these things, great. Whatever your main VLAN you're using is, in this case, 1, set the untagged to 1, the PVID to 1, and then tag whatever else you need on there. So in this case, I'm tagging port 2 where I need it, which is basically just on the network port on the physical mini PC. The access point could, if I were doing guest network, also have tagging. I believe it's just untagged though, and also my uplink is untagged VLAN 2. And then, like I say, the mini PC gets both. So, now what? We went through a lot of technical mumbo jumbo and maybe confused some people along the way and made some people want to go to sleep. But we've got a functioning HomeLab. So go learn something. Spin up some more VMs, spin up some more Docker containers. And what do you want to see during the demo portion? Anyone have anything specific they want to see as a demo? No? Nobody wants to see anything. Okay. All right. So, question. Oh, we got one for the demo? Set up an RSS feed? I don't know how to do that. Here, you can come up here. I'll get you to shell access. So how about questions? Anyone have questions on any of this? Yeah. So the question is, do I have my own personal home lab? And if so, do I follow this setup? Yes and no. So this is my own personal home lab that I set up specifically for this talk. And again, some of it is stuff I've learned along the way. If I were going to do this fresh and I had to buy all new hardware, I would very much set it up like this because it would be so much easier than what I've done so far. But at home, what I actually have for a home lab is I do have dual ISP and I do have the dual homed on both. So I can lose either internet and both my home lab and my home prod continue to function. They each have their own dedicated 42U server rack. So I'm at a little bit more scale than this, if you will. Now, what do I use those for? Not much. Trevor, who managed to break into SSH during the CTF that I did that was run from my home lab at home. It uses a bunch of repurposed hardware and some sketchy stuff and an unmanaged switch and some managed switches and whatnot. And then home prod is a bit different. The one thing that is very, very similar to this and both the home lab and home prod, though, is that they do all use OpenSense in some form. They all touch Unify in some form, and they all have router on a stick in one way or another. So yes, I have HomeLab that I use, but typically it's a bit more than that one. Any other questions? Yeah. Say that again? Can you make Mac OS VMs that work? Probably. Can I do it? No, absolutely not. Can you do it? If you Google hard enough, I'm sure you can. There is a community known as the Hackintosh community. And until Apple kills off the code bases completely for all those computers, and potentially even beyond that if you're willing to compile from source, I would expect that there is a way to get it working. Is it useful? I'm not so sure. If you're really in the Mac ecosystem and you don't want to fight it a lot, I would probably just buy like a Mac Mini to do that thing. I've also heard, now this was back in the iSeries days of Apple, so I'm not sure if it still holds true, but I've heard that it's actually relatively trivial to get a Mac OS VM running on Mac hardware. So if you were to install, say, the Proxmox on the Mac Mini hardware and then put an OS on top of that, I've heard that that's pretty trivial. I personally play around with Mac OS very little, only if I'm working on a demo or something, so I'm not super familiar with it. But that's a good question. Is there a better alternative to ubiquity switches that isn't quite as finicky? And/or networking equipment. There are lots of alternatives. I do generally find they are, to an extent, you get what you pay for. One of the series that I've had a lot of good luck with is the Cisco SG series, as well as some HP V1910, 1920, whatever they're on series. I'm not a command line person when it comes to configuring switches, so I'm looking for a web UI that more or less just works. I have done a fair bit with the V1910, a few V1920, and some Cisco SG series. Some of that has been professionally, some of that has been decommed equipment I got my hands on and just, it works. Ubiquity is sort of the big name because they do more or less just work. They make it really easy. They are sort of a cross between the ease of use offline capable web UI directly on the device like the lower end HP or the TP-Link or MicroTix, another brand I've heard decent things about. and crossing that with something like, say, Meraki, where you just go to a cloud, do the thing, and it figures out the magic on the back end to make it happen. I did a thing with Meraki one time, for example, that I could have done with Ubiquiti, but it was Meraki gear I was dealing with, where we needed we needed a brand new VLAN, and we just needed it to be a nothing. That was basically a long extension cable across like almost 1,000 feet across this building. And I needed a port there, and I needed a port there. And I just told Meraki, hey, here's a VLAN that doesn't exist. Put it on these 2 ports. And it said, okay. And it worked. And Ubiquiti is kind of like that. Like you can just kind of tell it stuff, and it goes, yeah, I got you back. Done. So if that's the level you're working at, I think they very well could be worth the price. They don't have quite the finesse that some of the others do. Although if you're doing Dante, if any of you are into audio stuff and do Dante, they recently supported Dante from what I understand, which is they were one of sort of the last big vendors to not have any support for that. So yeah, good questions. I'm not super familiar with a bunch. There are options, but it really depends on your specific needs, wants, and whatever. Yeah, any other questions? Nothing? Nobody has anything else specific they want to see on the demo? All right. I'll call it good then.